Welcome to OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and we are pleased to invite you to the first webinar in a four-part webinar series on anti-racism and anti-oppression organizational change, ARAO. So the first webinar in the series is titled Make Your Organization More Accessible and Inclusive. Staff and leadership of organizations charged with implementing and monitoring are often challenged with where to start. Part of that challenge is in being clear about what ARAO-related initiatives actually look like in practice. For this series of four webinars, OCASI's Access and Equity Standards will provide an explicit guidepost, specifically as it relates to the immigrant-serving sector. This first webinar in the series of four will set the stage by reviewing key principles of ARAO, their relationship with the OCASI Access and Equity Standards, and the implications for your organizational development. Areas that we are hoping to cover in the first webinar include what is an ARAO framework, an introduction to cultural competency and culturally competent practice, and making the case, articulating and communicating the rationale for ARAO organizational development to stakeholders. So my name is Beth Jordan, and I own and operate Adobe Consulting Services, and we do training, planning, and evaluation for not-for-profit organizations. We work across a number of different sectors, and it's been an honor and a privilege to do this work in community, with community, for about 15 years. And my colleague Douglas Stewart will introduce himself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. Not necessarily morning where you are listening to this, right? So I own and operate Competence Consultants and Associates, and we do very similar work to Adobe Consulting. And we both also are colleagues with a group of consultants for the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care AIDS Bureau, which is called the Ontario Organizational Development Program, which basically provides community capacity and organizational development capacity support to organizations that provide HIV and AIDS services in Ontario. And other than that, we are sort of tried and true activists who think that this work is really anchored in important, social movements and, striving for social justice.
Absolutely. Okay, and so what you should know about this webinar is that this is our second go-round. We are doing this webinar now without an audience because of the joys of technology. Something happened to the first webinar that we did. So you will see as we move through, there will be some poll questions, and we'll do our best to try and remember, what the context of that was and what respondents were talking about. But it's just not the same without people there. So we're going to walk through it, and we hope that you enjoy it and it gives you something. So the objective is to provide the rationale and begin considering tools for ARAO organizational change within your organization. And as we talked about earlier, we're covering what the framework is, introducing, which is probably not an introduction to most of you, but at least being clear about what it means in our context, cultural competency and culturally competent practice, and then making that case, right? So how do you articulate and communicate the rationale for embedding this kind of development in your organization? So the first question that we asked people who are participating in the first webinar was how many of you would say that your organization is actually working on the first Access and Equity Standard, which is our organization addresses systemic issues that impact the lives of immigrants and refugees. And almost everybody that participated in that poll said yes. In some way, shape, or form, they were, in fact, addressing systemic issues that impact the lives of immigrants and refugees. And, I mean, that is essentially, the nature of what you do is to provide services and support, and that in and of itself is starting to address, right, systemic issues which disenfranchise and cause disadvantage for immigrants, refugees, newcomers. So What is the context for an integrated ARAO framework? A lot of things, and as you're sitting there listening to this, I'm sure you're coming up with your own ideas around, the context and why. We just have a few here for you to think about and consider. And so, I think most importantly is the need for folks to integrate and understand that this framework is rooted in a history, right? That it's social, it's political, and it's economic, and the impact on folks sits in all of those realms. I mean, unfortunately today we have many, many, many examples of the life and death nature of this kind of disenfranchisement and disadvantage, and to call names like Mike Brown, Tamir Rights, I mean the list goes on and on, but importantly, we do this work so that we can respect the self-determination of the First Peoples of this continent, Aboriginal, First Nations, Inuit, Métis folks. We're clear that the intersections of our identities, so LGBTIQ2SA identities, often dismissed and not integrated, and want to be clear that this framework is integrated. We're thinking about all of who we are. So committing to the framework, we'd like to share with you at this time a quote from Nelson Mandela. And he says, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." And, at this time we sort of ask the participants, what does this mean to you? What do you think he's trying to say? And for us, what we see here is that this is work that we must and have to do together. That it's not just about what we need and what we think is pressing for us, but it is about understanding it fully in an integrated way, and that we walk through these processes together, and that we're stronger together, right? It's also the notion that the chains that we're casting off when we think about oppression are not just physical chains, but also psychological chains, and the need to be clear not only in our actions, but in our heads about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
As well as being an ally, right? The whole idea that we, in doing this work, we don't have a choice in which, issue we engage or challenge or we interrupt. It's really about recognizing that if you're working with the demographics that you're providing services to, that you can't pick and choose which issue, because it's coming up in people's lives in ways that we have to engage. And so seeing ourselves as not just working for our own interests or for particular interests, but to really look at the broader picture of how oppression is working in our society around us for all groups in all kinds of ways.
Absolutely. And so there are all kinds of ways to define oppression, and I'm certain as you're seeing this, you're thinking, oh, well, I would add this or I would take that away. Perfect, that's fine. But for our purposes, we want to just give you, an example of what we're talking about. So when we define oppression, we would say that oppression exists when one social group exploits another social group to its own benefit. And this is knowingly or unconsciously, right? You don't have to intend to oppress for oppression to, in fact, be happening. It results in privilege for the dominant group and disenfranchisement for the subordinated group. We understand that it can be achieved, oppression, through force or through the control of social institutions and resources of a society. And at this point, I think in the last webinar, we had thrown out to participants, what are some of the ways or what some of the social institutions that are controlled, right? And people talked about the media, they talked about education systems, they talked about civil and criminal law, and the list goes on and on, right? So importantly, after a while, it really doesn't require that conscious thought or effort of any individual members of the dominant group. It just becomes normal, right? Because it's institutionalized, it sits in every place, and you actually don't even realize that it's there. And so it's that normalizing which we really need to interrogate, pull apart, deconstruct. We see it, and we'll talk about the 3 Ps, the personal, the professional, and the political. But oppression is, of course, individual, it's institutional, and it's systemic. It always starts with us, right? Personally, how do we walk in the world? Are we clear about the privilege that we walk with, or where we're target group members? And this becomes important because you as individuals in your organization then translate that into practice, right? So if you're pulling and bringing into your practice bias or unresolved understandings of who various folks are, this can become a problem. And if you're not aware of your privilege, that can also become a problem because you start to bump into not only your coworkers, but the folks who, that you serve. Institutionally, it's those institutional structures, the policies, the practices that, again, create advantages for people of the dominant culture, and discrimination, oppression, and disadvantage for racialized and marginalized groups of people. And then, importantly, all of this is supported by a very specific ideology which supports that system of oppression, right? And the problem here is that that ideology is often unexamined and, again, makes this oppression look normal and justified, right? So the 3 Ps, the personal, the professional, and the political. So what is the ARIO framework? Quite simply, it is an active framework. It is about engaging. It is about identifying oppression, understanding how it's working, and then dismantling it. And for our purposes, dismantling it in your organizations, fighting and advocating against it where you see it in society in terms of how it affects folks that are using your services, and ensuring that your programs and services are barrier-free, bias-free, and are not places where oppression can live. So oppression is a cycle, and the ARIO framework is about interrupting, right, that cycle of oppression at various points, whether you do that personally, professionally, or politically, or in all of those 3 areas. The cycle of oppression, of course, aggression, as we identified as that domination of an individual or group by another more powerful individual or group. It is the use of cultural, economic, physical, and psychological or social threats and or force, the perpetuation of misinformation and ignorance manifested as an explicit ideology, which becomes then the justification for further mistreatment, manifested in our organizations and institutional structures and programs, as well as within us, which is, of course, then the systemic mistreatment of racialized and marginalized people, and so it goes. So when you look at this cycle, think about how you personally interrupt, right? Where you may draw a personal line and say, no, I'm not okay with this. You may act as an individual. Where do you do this in your practice? Where does it happen for you professionally? How does your organization do this in the programs and services that it offers? And then politically, how are you doing this? How are you bringing the information that you know about the people who use your services? How are they engaged with you as an organization to be a part of social policy conversations? How are they a part of developing the services that you provide, right? And evaluating those services. So it's something to think about, that cycle of oppression, and within the ARIO framework, how you are interrupting, intentionally interrupting.
And so therefore, in doing that interruption, we want to now start to think about how do you concretize this in practice in your organization. And so a framework that we often like to get people to think about is cultural competence, right? And so we want to really be clear though about when we're saying cultural competence, what we mean, because that can be a very trigger term for a lot of folks in terms of how it's defined and used by different people doing this kind of work. So we want to be very clear with you what we mean by using this term. So we like to start off with a little multiple choice question. So is it a government initiative to increase visible minority representation, KFC's new light menu, or the latter, a set of congruent attitudes, behaviors, and policies that come together in an agency, system, or among professionals to enable them to effectively work in cross-cultural situations?
KFC's light menu.
All right. So it could be. That could be an element, no question, you know. And people sometimes push back and said, but even, there are initiatives that governments are implementing, kind of like you listening to this webinar, thinking about, so what am I going to put into practice? So there are different elements. But you see, C for us is really more of a summary of what we mean by cultural competency, right? So it's really about starting to think about, so how do you concretize an ARA or framework in your organization, right? How can people see it, feel it? How do people, staff or stakeholders in the organization know how to live it, how to actually breathe the experience of cultural competency? So this is what we're going to walk you through for the rest of this webinar to give you some examples of what that looks like can look like in your organization.
And just to back up to that term, visible minority. We put that in there almost in a sense to trick you, right? Because the language visible minority is really problematic language that we should be troubling regularly. It is the language of the federal government, understood, but it also is the language of dominance, and it's important to name that, right? So if we were actually going to be talking about racialized folks, we would be saying racialized folks, or we would be identifying a particular group, or saying world majority people, because in fact the folks that are identified here in Canada as visible minorities are actually world majority people.
And some of you probably do remember a famous hockey pundit who, in response to some of the initiatives by the City of Toronto, had that response, actually, that very first quote, and used that language. So it's often the language of also resistance, right? People using that dominant language as a way of questioning and challenging and trivializing some of the great efforts that many of us are doing to try to move equity efforts forward. The other reason why it's really important to look at cultural competence and be really clear about this definition is because some people's interpretation of cultural competence is sometimes defined as what we call cultural sensitivity, right? Or learning about people's various cultures to determine how we're going to treat them, which really then, reduces, it's very reductionist in terms of how any of us live our lives and how any of us define ourselves, right? We are much more complex, dynamic, intersectional, meaning that we're never just one identity. So to study any element of our culture to try to understand any group of people is very, it's never going to be enough to actually get us where we need to go in terms of being accountable around the histories of inequities, oppressions, the way it lives and sits in people's lives today, and also how it might sit within our organization. So while it might be an element of what we want to do to understand, have a baseline, we've got to go much further than to understand the complexity of how all this fits together. And that's what we want to walk you through and weave you through. So as examples. So as concepts, frameworks, thinking about the values and principles that are underpinning how you understand cultural competence in your organization. So it's really stepping back and thinking about, do you have a defined set of values, principles, as well as is there clear messaging to folks in your environment about behaviors that are expected, attitudes, and then very critically, do you have that in policy? Is it written down, right? Are there expectations documented that keeps clear messages? Is it also within your structure that, this is also anchored so that people are really clear about what are the expectations about how you work effectively, cross-culturally, but also what supports are there within the organization to do that, right? So you want to start reflecting on, do you have clear, anchors that message a valuing of diversity, that you have systems and structures in place that to allow for people to conduct self-assessment, that we in your organization are able to manage dynamics of difference. So it's one thing to do the recruitment that brings in a diversity of human resources, a diversity of, and that includes volunteers, board members, but also attracting a diversity of clients. But then internally you don't have the systems to support their integration into the organization, meaning that their actual effective participation, not just inclusion, because the question we always have to ask about inclusion is that who's including who, and including whom in what. And when you start to expand and increase engagements of diversity of folks in your environment, how are they able to participate and engage and also shift how the organization lives to be able to engage their differences, right? And also then to acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge. So once we interact with the communities and we get information about what is critical to them in terms of participating in our environments, how do we ensure that that is integrated in how we actually live with that knowledge over time? And lastly, then to adapt to the diversity and the cultural concept the communities they serve. So to think about then, once we have clear cultural knowledge, how are we then being responsive in terms of making sure our environments are also adapting and engaging those folks where they are? And lastly, incorporate the above in all aspects of the organization. So policymaking, administration, practice, service delivery, and we asked the participants the last time to think of other examples of what that would look like. So really at all levels of the organization. And so we have to then think about how we then involve and get feedback and get engagement from consumers, key stakeholders, but also their wider communities. You'll often hear in the governance literature this term moral ownership or the ownership. So you always want to be thinking beyond just who's there now. So who are we ultimately here to serve in terms of a wider community, and to start to identify where the gaps may be based on that community, and how do we make sure we build partnerships, we have avenues of communication and engagement. That means that we're consistently hearing from that potential membership so that we're really actually doing the kind of job we're there to do in terms of serving those communities. And so really also be patient with yourself. So I know some of you are listening to this webinar thinking, by the end of this, I want to be able to walk to my organization and make it culturally competent and have an error framework living fabulously, right? And just to say that this is a developmental change process. It's going to take time. It's going to evolve. The very first poll question that we asked you in terms of how many of you are living that first standard, right? Folks were at different levels of at the continuum of where they are in doing that. So you're starting at different places, right? So you're not going to get to the end right away. And in fact, it's an ongoing process of evaluation. It's an ongoing process of identifying what you need to be doing that keeps continuing as a dynamic engagement process. So it's really about being aware of where you are at different levels in terms of your awareness, your knowledge, and your skills along this continuum to know then what's the work you've got to do to move forward. And that's what we're going to walk you through the next few slides. So organizationally, what you want to start to think about is that that you sanction and in some cases mandate the incorporation of cultural knowledge into your policymaking infrastructure and practice, right?
And sometimes people say sanction, mandate, and we say yes, absolutely, because it is important that it is understood that this is an expectation. It isn't an option. It is a way in which organizations will work. It is a way that you'll be accountable. And it ensures that it in fact happens, because if you are a member of an equity-seeking group, a racialized community, a marginalized community, you will know and understand that unless things are mandated, sometimes they don't happen, right? So we're being very clear, sanctioned, mandated.
As well as that we need to then have equal access and non-discriminatory practices in service delivery. So, again, many of us are funded and charged with making sure that those services are in place. However, we notice maybe patterns of who is using those services, and it's not equitable, right? And so it's about having to make sure then that when we review, we are always hearing from the folks who potentially are not using those services about why and how those barriers might be there so that we can actually honestly engage and address those issues and those barriers. And so the other piece then is your practice and your service design. So what we want to then do is ensure that you're identifying and understanding the needs of individuals. And we've been talking about how it's really important to engage the communities that you're serving and to make sure that you've got process for communication that helps to give you that feedback and information. It means then that you're tailoring and matching your services to the unique needs of the people you're serving. So whether that's individuals, that includes children, includes organizations and communities that you're serving. And we have children there, but it could be women, it could be specifically directed to particular immigrants, particular communities or countries, so a wide variety of different kinds of populations that you might be serving. And also that this practice should be driven by culturally preferred choices, not by culturally free intervention. So sometimes when we talk about cultural competence, what folks can mean is that, well, let's just not be in any way culturally responsive, right? Let's just sort of flatten and make neutral our services. However, that then can mean that folks who need particular issues addressed and particular kind of service needs met then get missed. And so it's really critical. And just to give you a simple example, so somebody with a disability who might need accommodation, right? To simply say, well, no, we're just simply going to just be available to everyone without any adjustments for particular kinds of interest would not actually then be meeting the needs of those particular individuals, right? In fact, that might create its own barrier in terms of how we provide services.
We are working out some technical challenges, so just bear with us. It's interesting. Technology is wonderful when it works, and when it doesn't, Douglas, I think we're good now.
We keep going?
Yes.
All right. So community engagement is another element that we've got to pay attention to. So this means, really pay attention to the concept of self-determination to the community. So making sure that, as we might define a service, that again, is that, again, community engagement to ensure that folks are also have autonomy within it, are also defining how we're providing services. Going back to the concept of the Nelson Mandela quote, so thinking about working as allies with folks, right, that we're standing shoulder to shoulder with them. There are many quotes we could use, and there's another one that we often use that really talks about, if we're here sort of to, in a charitable manner, to sort of help people get to where they need to go without recognizing how that has implications for us and what we can also learn in the experience and the process, then, we're really not standing side by side or shoulder to shoulder with someone. We are starting to have all kinds of expectations. So you hear language like, oh, they're not compliant, right? Or people are ungrateful for what we're doing for them. Well, no, we're here working in solidarity with communities to enable them to self-determine and access what they need to ensure that there's real fairness and equity in our society. Right?
That's a really good point, Douglas, because it moves us out of that charitable model of service delivery, which is intensely problematic, to a solidarity model, an empowerment model, which really is about we're providing a service and support alongside, working with, directed by folks that are using those services and support, which means they will evolve, which means that they will be evaluated, which means there will be accountability. So that charitable model, we're really pushing organizations to really think about, right, self-determination and embracing a model, a solidarity model, which is about empowerment for you, them, everybody involved.
And you might be sitting there going, solidarity model, what are they talking about? What does that look like? Well, just read the rest of the slides, the slide right here, right? So you'll see it is about working in conjunction with natural, informal support and helping networks within the diversity of communities that you're providing services to. So again, think about where those levels of engagement is. Is it with the community newspapers? Is it with, social media that communities are using? Is it with, going to their faith institutions? Is it about how you link with the ways in which those communities are occupying space in your communities around you, right? So you think about neighborhood, civic, and advocacy associations, alliance groups, ethnic, social, and religious organizations, spiritual leaders, and healers. And then also in this, communities determine their own needs. Members are full participants in decision making. So again, think about even your boards. Think about your subcommittees. Think about the various elements of your, even as you're developing program planning. Who's sitting in those program planning meetings, right? How are you doing consultation? What is the evaluations that you're doing? And are you actually reviewing those evaluations? Because many people do evaluations, but are they actually pulling those together and looking at what the feedback is telling us? And how is that affecting how we're then moving forward as an organization, right? And so community engagement should result in the transfer of knowledge and skills among all collaborators and partners. It's not a one direction. We're all learning and benefiting and supporting each other in terms of moving this forward. So why cultural competency within an ARIO framework? If it hasn't been clear so far, really it's about mirroring the community. So again, it's making sure that the processes and the policies that we have in place really are informed by and really reflect the interests and the needs of the community. Also, that there is real access and inclusion. So those are buzz terms that people often use. But we also want you to be able to concretize that. So we want to think about who are the internal and external stakeholders and how are they engaged with the organization. Also doing the right thing. So at the end of the day, there are social justice commitments and change that we're all working towards. And so if you answer the first question in terms of being on the continuum of the first organizational standard, then what you're really saying is that you're committing to not just doing what we call minimum standard, right? Because some of this work in org-wise by OCASI, it's about really looking at how do we advance beyond just what the legal minimum might be, the funding minimum might be, to really look at how do we really enhance the interests and needs of immigrants in Ontario. And so in that respect, it's really important for us to be honoring those standards in terms of moving beyond just the minimum to ensure that we're doing our part in social justice and change. And also, but we also have to come back to also compliance. At the end of the day, we are legal entities. We have to manage risk and liability. And there are expectations from many people in your environment who are regulated professionals. Not to mention, as funded agencies, there are some commitments that we need to honor and follow. Beyond that, there's also other legislation that we need to be in compliance with. So think of things like violence in the workplace legislation, human rights legislation, and others you can think of, Beth, off the cuff.
No.
All right.
But they're there, definitely. Yeah. I think you said professional associations, but many people within organizations are accountable to those professional bodies, and they, that's a part of it, right? Again, minimum standards, but moving as organizations to, as Douglas indicated, a higher standard, which is that commitment throughout your organization.
And I think speaking to that higher standard is think about that as agencies serving immigrants. Immigrants are moving around the globe. And many people who are in our services have traveled across all kinds of borders. Through the UN, there are various conventions that, again, if you think about going beyond minimum standard of just our legislation and our laws, and thinking about even this list of obligations that we have to implement this framework, it's really about how do we lift up and unearth and live those commitments internationally that are going to impact folks who are here in our services. Because the folks who are here in our services also have relationships across those borders still. They either have other family members who are at risk in other parts of the world that might eventually need to move or travel. We also have commitments to honor, because many of us probably also have partnership efforts on the ground in various other parts of the world, as well as we're wanting to have a global conversation about rights, equal rights, equity and justice issues, that affect people wherever they live on this planet.
So, I mean, those are essentially human rights issues, right? That you are embedding the principles of areal and cultural competence in your organization, which is in line with many international instruments, conventions, so on and so forth. And so, when we think about why cultural competency within the areal framework, Douglas and I always ask that question. So, do you want to know, right, how you're landing? Do you want to know how your services are impacting the community? And if things weren't going positively or in a way that felt good or inspired change or provided appropriate support, would you want someone to tell you? And so we had polled the audience, and folks said, yes, absolutely, we would want to know. And that is the idea of intent versus impact. Right? So when we think about our intent, most of us in this work are not here to do harm, right? That's not the plan. We're here to be a part of a social service organization, social justice movements, and professional practice which empowers folks. So when we think about the fact that maybe some of our personal interactions or professional practices or organizational behaviors and culture could be actually causing harm to people, it makes us take a deep breath. And we like to use this picture here, and I'm sure you can see it. It's a polar bear and an Arctic wolf, and the polar bear is saying, I will love him and pet him and squeeze him and call him George. And the Arctic wolf was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. He is not enjoying himself, but the polar bear's got a smile on his face, and he seems really happy, right? So two creatures here in the similar, say, having the same experience but not having the same experience, right? Intent versus impact. The polar bear's intent is not landing the way he would want it to. And this is how we need to think about our organizations. What we intend, if we want to know how it is in fact landing, we need to start measuring, we need to start asking questions and engaging in culturally competent ways with our community of stakeholders. Is that making sense, right? Yeah? I'm asking if it's making sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Good, because you're the only person in the room right now, right? We're going to engage Petra as well, who's our fabulous Ocasi person who is making sure we don't stop the recording on you. Okay, so keep going. And so when we think about areal change as an organizational development process, I really hope that you're seeing it also as an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity in terms of you as an individual within the organization, but it's also an opportunity in terms of the system, right? Your organization as a system. So for you and staff and other folks, it is an opportunity to explore how our own life experiences have molded who we are, and how we understand our identity and the identities of others. And most importantly, getting clear about our own power, right? And the ways in which, remember the polar bear, we may or may not, right, be bumping into people in a way that causes harm. And where we are clear about our points of privilege, leveraging that, acting as an ally, moving things forward. So it is an opportunity in that sense. In addition, in terms of systems, organizations need to view this not as a punitive process or a tick box or a balanced scorecard per se that, oh, we've failed or no, it is an opportunity to look at formal and informal policies, processes, and practices, and to see how, if we're honestly looking at how we conduct our business, how we develop and deliver services, how can that get better? Right? How can we infuse and integrate those concepts that Douglas was talking about earlier? So it is an opportunity, not without, right, some discomfort, some challenge, but that's what this work is about. If you're not uncomfortable at times, then usually the work isn't happening.
Yeah, and I think that if you are at any point in the continuum, because that question Beth asked earlier to think about is if in fact there are ways in which your service might be landing the ways that you want it to, would you want to know? So then, and we know most people would say, yeah, I want to know. That's what we got back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then we always push people a little bit and said, okay, so what's been your experience though when somebody points out something that you're not doing well? Right? And then we, if people are honest, and we often will share for ourselves that, initially there's a sort of bit of a defensiveness, a little bit of a resistance, and basically it's a bit of an annoyance at ourselves that, we're not getting it quite right. So that can sometimes make us a little bit hesitant to look at it. We also get concerned that when we have to note what we're not doing so well, we wonder about the agenda of the folks who are saying so. We think it might be they're trying to harm us or trying to make us look bad or feel worse than we are, or they're probably messaging to us that we can never get this right. Right? So want to ask you to really be patient with yourselves because, again, as we keep saying, this is that ongoing developmental process. There are going to be many times that you're going to get people to point the finger and say, you're not doing this quite right, right? And it doesn't mean that you'll never be able to do it right or that we're terrible, horrible folks who can never get this right. It's really about opportunity for new learning and growth. But making sure as you walk through the different processes throughout the 4 webinars, I'm really going to encourage you at this point that this is why it's critical that you don't just do one webinar and you skip the rest. It's really important to see them all connected to each other because that's where you get the opportunity to really explore what are the different places where there's opportunity for learning, for getting feedback, being able to look at so what would be helpful then as a response to keep moving you forward so that you do have in place the kind of framework that means that whatever comes at you in terms of questions or challenges or even difficult journeys that you have to go through this, you can weather that storm. And that's what we've put together in this series of webinars to help you to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so where does the framework apply, as Douglas articulated? Essentially everywhere, right? The better question is, where doesn't it apply? And we've yet to figure that out, right? So it's in policy, it's in employment systems, in management practices, in your complaints processes, in your communication with stakeholders, internally and externally. It's in your programs and work with communities, so that engagement. It's in educational and professional development, and very importantly, monitoring and accountability. And so when we talk about, types of AREO initiatives, as Douglas indicated earlier in the session, there's a range, right? There is a continuum, and different organizations enter at different points. So for some, there'll be none or informal, right? And so we want to move you to the second one where you're attempting to create. And most of you indicated in the first webinar that you are indeed attempting to create, right? And where we hope, right, that gold star, if you will, is that extensive attempts, right? So where you are intentionally, with purpose, with resources, both human and financial, making shifts and changes within your organization, and there is an annual commitment to do that. So question that we had asked, again, of the participants was, where were you currently at? And I think there were most people, the bulk of folks were actually at 2, attempting to create.
Yes.
Maybe a couple were in extensive attempts, but the sort of the bulk was number 2 attempted to create. And so when we think again about area organizational change, again, a developmental change process, it's planned, it's participatory, and the change you are seeking is systemic, right? So I mentioned the word intentional. You are intentionally setting out to achieve something. And this is important because when there is intent, you're essentially stating your goal and objectives, right? And you need those objectives to measure your impact, right? Very, very important. So why are you doing this? You figure that out, set it down in writing, and then you can come back after you've moved through that process. You can see, how did we do? Where are the learnings? How might we shift and change what we've tried? It's participatory. There are so many skills lying in the folks who work in your organization and in terms of the folks who use your organization. So you want to be pulling on all of those skill sets, internally, externally. You need to prepare a plan. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? Implement the plan, right? You may set up task groups to do that. You may have different programs and departments working on that. But you want to make sure that you set up the structures to get things done, okay? You want to know who's responsible for what, and supervision and support needs to be provided. The change we're seeking, not superficial. You are actually hoping, right, to significantly change the way your organization operates and or to enhance that, right? So that is the goal. Again, remember those 3 Ps. It's that political, it's that pushing on the systems and the structures that really allows people to be liberated, allows people to have equitable access to services and supports they need, and for you and your work with immigrant communities allows people to access the life in Canada that they thought they were coming for, right? And to be able to be full and active participants in Canadian society, respected active participants, not target individuals, which unfortunately we see all too often, and even, you know, most recently, if we want to talk about the barbaric cultural practices proposal, the bill that's moving through, it's just a fright, right? So this is why it is incredibly important to be vigilant. CASI is obviously engaged in advocating around this kind of stuff, but you and your organizations, the direct impact is on the people that you serve.
And I think that last point on systemic change is really key, right? It's about how you pay attention to the folks who are most disadvantaged, right? So at the end of the day, while you're there for everyone, in terms of your demographic of the people that are your client base and your client group and your ownership, again, remember that piece, we talk about your membership, and you want to always be aware of that. But at the end of the day, it's when it starts to really impact the folks who you're seeing most marginalized within those services, and you find that you have in place the systems and the policies that support them getting also what the organization is there to do for communities that you're providing services to. And so the next slide is starting to move us into how we're going to be working with you for the next series of webinars, because one of the things that most often people say to us, well, we've got to make the business case, right? We want to be able to get buy-in, and we want to get people to understand why we need to do this. And so some of you listening to this, as we're on the initial go at this, people said, well, you know, that's part of it's about some of us, even who are sitting on this webinar, not the people in the decision-making positions. We're not the ones with the ultimate power to make this happen, but we're committed to this, and so we're here to get some information about how we can take this back to the organization. So even if this slide is helpful to share with, you know, some of your leadership around, so in the center you'll see at the end of the day for us about having an area framework active through cultural competent practice is really to ensure that you have a respectful, equitable, accessible, and diverse work environment programs and services. And we say that because often people will say, well, shouldn't we be doing diversity work and have diversity workshops and you know, and deal with diversity? And so we want to say that, you know, you're going to achieve diversity by putting in place an ARO framework through culturally competent practice to actually achieve that. The other way to look at this as well is that if you look around your environment, you already have a very diverse environment in terms of various layers. So that's the work that you're needing to do. It's about looking at what gets in the way of that diversity being engaged, being in your organizations, being actively participating, not just at the service level, but at all levels of your organization. So hopefully, if you're listening to this webinar, you're not just thinking about how do we diversify our client group. It's also looking through who's where in your organization, who has power, who has voice, who makes decisions, right? So what's the dynamics between how folks are engaging with each other? So if you look around the circle, you'll see that we start with at the top again, demographics. So thinking about who is involved and who's engaged, and also who is not. Starting to think of the various legislation. So human rights, Bill 168, so violence in the workplace, AODA, Accessibility for Persons with Disabilities Act. But think about other compliance legislation. So you've got the criminal code, right? You've got occupational health and safety generally.
Employment standards.
Employment standards. So if you go through all the lists, so we're responsible, accountable at all levels. And this is really important messaging, not just within the organization in terms of the human resources at the staff level, but the board. Critically, your directing minds, which is what they're called legislatively, right, are accountable to ensure that you as an organization stand behind this commitment in terms of how you are meeting your mission, your vision, and your values. And sometimes some of this work may require the board at that board level, even in their strategic planning efforts with the organization, to start to even look at those terms to see if they're actually messaging really clearly those expectations and obligations around ARAO, right? And so that then leads to the next element of the circle, which is organization mission, vision, values, and policies. But then many of you within this sector are also honoring equity standards, right? That then should also fit with your funder requirements. And then at the end of the day, what they should all do is benefit your work environment and your client services. And as Beth has mentioned, you've got to be able to measure that benefit, right? So one is that we'll be talking with you about over the next series, as we move through the series, is really about how do you do that kind of measurement. And as we move to the next slide, it's really just to sort of let you know then where we're moving forward. So yeah, strategies for moving forward, very straightforward. But then that piece around how do you begin to measure your organization's consistency with the access and equity standards through articulating a guiding framework and policy and thinking about then who shepherds this process. As I mentioned before, many of you on this, listening to this, like many on the initial webinar, broadcast for this, were really saying that, there are different points in the organization. So starting to think about, do we have a committee? Do we have an advisory? Should it be staff that shepherds it? Should it be the board? Should we include members of the community? So really to start to walk with you through that process. And then looking at how you establish a baseline for tracking progress, how you start to assess the barriers in your organization, and then finally what we want to wrap up with is making sure that you walk away with some clear tools for and strategies for meaningful change. So that might look at include things like training, policies, other practices, and other resources. Beth, any other thoughts?
No, I think we've covered it. The upcoming webinars are interesting and, as Douglas said, very practical, right? So not much theory and more about, okay, so let's get this done and what might it look like, providing you with concrete resources to do that. So as always, OrgWise has a hub of resources. You can see the website there below on the slide. We always encourage you to check in. The resources are constantly being updated. As you can see, this webinar originally was conducted Friday, November 8th at 2013. And we do thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you. So we're going to have coffee.